can start.
A very good evening to all the members who have registered for the session. Myself, CA Rekha Umaship, Regional Council Member, SARC. I take immense pleasure in welcoming you all for this session on IT audit. So this is one topic that has been very widely discussed these days, especially when we have most of the GST audits and tax audits and most traditional audits. We have a risk of taking traditional audit these days, and even because of the government rules, changes in the rules and regulations. So it is a time when we are shifting towards IT audit. So it is not merely just evaluation of the financial soundness or financial stability of a company, but with respect to how the management controls, with respect to the risk that is affecting an entity. So it is high time there is a new audit coming, how we migrate into IT audit. So now today I have the pleasure of inviting a faculty for the day, CA Narasimhnan Elangovan sir. So before I introduce sir, I need to tell sir is my guru for the DISA classes. So actually long back, I think 3-4 years back, I have met sir. He was my faculty for DISA and always indebted to you, sir, for that. So sir is again a DISA and a CISA holder and LLB graduate, and he's also partner of Ken & Co and a senior advisor for digital security services in Crow Advisory Services. Sir is basically a futurist, a GRC professional, a keynote speaker. So I think the areas of practice, you can summarize the entire IT arena. I think I can shorten his resume to the entire IT arena. He's practicing in data analytics, which is a very upcoming niche area. Then risk-based audit, privacy impact assessments, internal audits, information system assurance, internal financial control, SOX compliance, and SOC audits. And he has also been advising in emerging areas, especially in AI, blockchain, cloud computing, cybersecurity, and big data. He has also spoken in these domains in national as well as international forums. And he has also assisted a wide variety of entities, especially starting from startups to large corporates in the field of BFSI, telecom. Again, there is a whole new area which he has covered: airline, e-commerce, government, foreign countries, and many cross-functional organizations. He's basically a faculty for DISA and CISA. I mean, that is basically how I have got to know Narasimhan sir, and especially courses on blockchain technology. And he has authored more than 4 books for ICI, KCCA on technology, and he's a regular speaker on technology at various national and international conferences for ICI, ISACA, CII, FICCI, etc. And he has often addressed the ISACA international conferences of the Asia CACS, especially Africa, North America, Europe. And he is almost considered as the top rated and youngest speakers. I think today's registration itself speaks for itself. So I think that there is a record number of registrations today. And he has also spoken at various international conferences at Dubai, Malaysia, Bangkok, Saudi, Geneva, Doha, Nairobi, and Singapore, and Kuwait and California also. And the icing on the cake is he has been identified as one of the top 10 influential consulting leaders in 2020, and annual recognition for torchbearers in the consulting sphere by the CEO Insight magazine. So I think SIRC wouldn't be much privileged to have anyone else here, sir. We are very, very privileged and indebted to have you here. I think the session is all yours, and everyone is waiting for a very enlightening session from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really an honor to be here amongst all of you. Of course, would have been wonderful to meet you in person, but with the many challenges, I think we found a comfort way of virtual sessions. And thank you so much, Rekha, for that quick and short introduction. And I'm going to quickly get into the slides without much of a delay. Could you please confirm if you're able to see my slides? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so the way we will be going ahead is we will start off this conversation by understanding what are the changes which has taken place in the last few years, why there is a risk which is actually coming up, and why IT risk is something which is spoken about, and how that translates into what is called as an IT audit, right? Because where there is a risk, that is where an audit typically comes, right? So that is where we will essentially be driving our entire conversation to, right? So with that as a context, I'm going to get quickly started. General disclaimer, the views are again personal, not that of my organization, Kenco. There's an approach in which you can, as an organization or as an individual, identify how to look into IT risk. Okay, so I thought let me keep the agenda covering a broad variety, because we have a lot of different type of people out here attending it, right? Some of them who have qualified recently, some of them probably veterans in the profession, who have digested the entire income tax GST legislations, right? Or you may have professionals who are trying to see, can I get into some other new domain of practice, etc. So I thought first let me touch upon some terminologies in information system audit, right? And what are those key things? And then how do I understand these cyber risks and cyber threats, the whole risk landscape, right? From the cyberspace, we'll also come into the technology related risk, how the IT risk could probably come out for an organization such as a BFSI or healthcare related. And then how do I get started doing an IT audit? What is the typical steps, right? And then towards the end, we will look into a small case study in terms of an SME client. What are the top 10 or what are the top 15 issues which normally keep coming, right? So that's the approach which we want to adopt here. First thing, let's spend some time is to get these terminologies right. And these terminologies are not rocket science. We've been hearing them, just that in the context of audit, right, in the context of IT, it makes more sense that we get a little we introspect them a little better, right? So the first thing is an information system. I mean, this is a very fundamental concept, right? So why are we even discussing about it? The reality today is anything in the technological world is driven by an information system. But the biggest myth is that the computer alone is responsible for everything. I, as a human being, I'm not responsible for anything. That is the biggest myth. Because I'll give a simple example. You go for a bank when you're doing a concurrent audit, or you're doing let's say, the statutory audit, year-end audit. One of the standard questions which you obviously ask is, how did the system do an NPA classification? And the standard response you will get is, sir, it's automatic, auto-generated, automatic. सब कुछ system करता है, yella system में part of the system में आनी चाहिए, sir, मार्क्स ले दो. All those standard dialogues you will get it, right? But the reality is there are certain fields which the user or which the branch manager or that particular accountant over there, or the clerk has to enter it. Based on that, the system classifies those things. An example could be the classification or the asset grouping, whether that particular loan or the advance is subject to some sort of a security or not. All of these are something which the person doing the data entry has to mention. If he or she does not mention that, right, what happens is that there is a risk that the entire thing or the entire provisioning system or any other calculation system can go wrong. Sorry, can I please request all of them to be on mute just to ensure? Thank you. Yeah. So this is basically will ensure that even if a process level some change happens, even at let us take an example, a human being incorrectly does a data entry, the system calculates from that. Right. So therefore, the very important lesson for us is the information system comprises of both the people and the process. Then there's an operating system, which is very, very fundamental, which actually does a host of these works of file management, memory, etc. Right. While I'm speaking today, I'm sure all of you are also doing some other activity, probably occasionally doing alt tab, coming onto the screen and going back and things like that. So all of these functions are actually an activity of an operating system. Management of files, memory, process management, handling input, all of this is typically case out. The most important thing in this entire pillar is application. Application or popularly referred to as an app, is the program, the software program, the core business logic is fed into this. It could be SAP, core banking software, it could be Zoom, right? All of these are all applications, right? And the applications by itself has certain controls embedded into it, which is called application controls, which we'll touch upon a little later. Now you have a dangerous word which is coming up, which is called as a malware, right? Earlier it was called as virus, and that the word slightly, virus was very restrictive in scope and it became much more bigger, right? Malicious software is what is called as a malware. The whole purpose or the whole unfortunate thing this malware does is it is designed to cause harm. It could be damage, it could be, copying your data and sending it to somebody else. It could be the operating system, it could be the entire network, it could be a server, it could be the client, the list is endless, right? So that's basically how the entire setup is. Then comes the next example is an antivirus and an anti-malware is a detox. It's basically a detox solution, or which is going to remove that, unfortunate thing and also help you to prevent certain things from coming up. The last two is business continuity and disaster recovery. This is very important from the business restart perspective, right? A business continuity plan is something which is much larger, of which one small part is a disaster recovery. Please bear in mind, a business continuity plan will not happen or will not be enforced at the time of disaster. A disaster recovery plan is enforced at the time of disaster. A BCP is a much larger set. Example, marking a fire exit, right? At the time of a fire, you don't want to search, oh my goodness, I forgot that, there's no fire exit out here. In the event of a disaster where there is an attack onto the system, at that point of time, I realize, oh, I have not backed up my data. No, that's a larger subset, disaster recovery. Immediately on the disaster, what is it that I do so that I can come back to the normal, at least the minimal, and then slowly come back to the normal, right? That's a disaster recovery planning. On the contrary, business continuity planning is a much larger subset, right? So that's basically where we start. If I take this conversation a little more ahead, right? Now going into little technical parts of it, and one of the areas which has to be audited by an auditor or looked into by an auditor is a change management. Now, change management refers to any changes made into the core or the infrastructure or the system or the structure of this particular organization or that particular application. Now, why is this important? This is important because, see, you have a well-defined software which is being tested. Now, during the year, some small changes taken place. Maybe a feature has been added, two features have been modified, something. The question is, the overall system, except for these two, remains the same. Now, when the overall system has not had much of changes, whereas only these two fellows have got some changes, it makes sense for us to test these so that I can get a comfort on the entire structure. A simplest example could be that your software getting updated because of the Finance Act being amended. Your income tax slab rates have changed, your GST calculation mechanism has changed, or the input credit mechanism has changed. So any of them could probably be a change management. And let me tell you, as an auditor, it is very crucial that you understand the change management process and the impact this brings on the organization. The reason is because changes, if done on an unauthorized manner, could have huge repercussions. I've seen organizations, especially the startups, payment gateways, where they have tie-ups, where they did some sort of a minor change. And unfortunately, that minor change brought in a extra or a deficit calculation of their commission. The commission is as small as, probably just 1 rupee or 30 paisa. But the organization deals with volume. The volume is, let's say, 30 crore or 500 crores. And 500 crores multiplied even into a small percentage is a huge cost for the company, right? And that is why a change management has to be extremely carefully looked into, right? The other thing which you have to look into is an incident management. Allow me to sip my tea as well, while you're having yours, right? So the incident management. Incident is basically an unplanned event. It could be a service interruption. It could be a virus attack. It could be a bug. It could be sharing of sensitive information. One of the most common incidents which we notice in our offices, right, is that you send a GST reminder or you send an income tax reminder to all your clients. You have a list of your clients in an Excel sheet, copy that and paste it. But sometimes what happens is, instead of putting your article staff or your employee, this happens everywhere, instead of putting the person's email ID in BCC, they put it in CC, or they put it as in 2. What happens? You get to know who are the persons to whom you have mailed. And it is not just you, everybody gets to know. Right? Imagine on a lighter note, you are dealing with two competitor companies. You're dealing with two competitor companies, A and B, right? That means it could be a possible scenario that you have shared some unwanted information to all of them, right? So that's where your incident management is very critical. How do you restore or how do you get back that confidence and bring it back into normal? That's covered in your incident management. Then a very powerful function, or a very powerful concept, which you have to be aware, is a segregation of duty. Oftentimes what happens at an IT level, the segregation of duties is not taken care of. If you ask from an accountant parlance, what will you say segregation of duty? You will say the entry passed by one person should be approved by another person. The same thing look from a technology perspective. The development done by one person should be deployed by another person or should be verified by another person. The change done by another person should be tested by another person in addition to this fellow trying to do it. That's why segregation of duties. And always bear in mind the developer will never have access to the production environment. Even if he has access, it is a temporary access only for that particular period. Now, if you look into applications like SAP, they have a concept called firefighter ID. You heard it right, firefighter, right? So what these firefighter IDs are, these are specialized roles which are given for a specific point in time, just like a firefighter. What does a firefighter do? In terms of emergency, he comes out, right? So these IDs are given to these people. Every activity of that person is tracked. So even if he does an unfortunate or tries to goof up something or tries to do a mischief, it is logged. Therefore, it is subject to some sort of a check. Please bear in mind, most of the times, right? Most of the times, the risk is reduced by merely the fact that there is some sort of a supervision or some sort of an audit or review. Many times, it is like, the simplest example on a lighter note, when we see a traffic constable or a police on the other side, we become a little, just promptly even 1 or 2%, a little extra conscious. It could just be 0.5% as well. Some people it could be much higher. Little more conscious, saying that, okay, whether I'm wearing a helmet, whether I'm wearing a seat belt, or whether I'm not using a mobile phone, I become a little extra conscious, right? The fact that there is a review mechanism brings in this, right? And that's where segregation of duty is very high, right? Taking this conversation further. If I look into any automated environment, what are the key features it should have? The typical key features which any automated environment will have people, process, and technology, but it will always have what is called applications. It will have what is called as operating systems, etc. Right? To understand this, I'm just giving an example. A client which you're auditing is working on an SAP environment, and it runs on a Unix server. And what is a Unix server? It's a simple operating system, right? And that is using an Oracle database. More often than not, most of your standard legacy applications, or rather most of the standardized applications, ERP solutions, use the Oracle database, right? Now, user, if he has to log in, he is authenticating himself with the same Windows login ID password, which is called as an Active Directory. So I log in through my laptop, the same credentials I also log in my SAP application. And if I have to log into my SAP application, I need to be connected with the corporate Wi-Fi or the network. And therefore, I have a Cisco network management software, which is connecting me. Right? So I have an application, I have an operating system, I have a network management software. All of these are smallest elements. You visit a bank branch, you will find all of these players. Right? The question is, what is the risk of any of these things going wrong? That is what, as IT auditors, you evaluate. And the moment you do that, you try to see what are the various possibilities or what are the various controls for that so that your risk is minimized. Bear in mind, risk can never be eliminated. It can only be minimized. A classical example, if I take a automated environment, is something what you see on the screen. You have a database. You may have an operating system, an OS. You have a storage device. You have a network device. You have networks such as LAN WAN. You have physical environment. Could be temperature controls, fire extinguishers, CCTVs, right? All of these are simple examples of layers of automated environment. Now, this is what, as an auditor, you look into when it comes to a level of audit, right? For each of them, you try to understand what are the risks. This is just an illustrative, right? You can go much beyond. Now, there are also softwares, and for that software, you're auditing the way in which they have developed, the change management, all of those also come into play, right? So this is one perspective of looking into an automated environment. Now that we got this preliminary concept clear, right? Now I think it makes sense for us to go into what are cyber risks and what are the possible threats, right? So if you read these words, what you see onto the screen, these are some of the classical scenarios and situations which each of us face. It could be an adware. What is an adware? You visited some website, some application you downloaded. The next time onwards, your browser settings itself has changed. You are getting very, very frequent advertisements. Your system is subject to an adware attack. Right? The simplest thing what you can do in all your offices to protect yourself is to disable the administrator access in all your laptops or your desktops. What does an administrator access do? It is the access which helps you to install or uninstall any software. Most of these attacks take place in a .exe file, and that .exe file has to execute, and therefore it requires administrator access. Imagine if you had disabled that administrator access, and there you go. There you have a big time saving in that respect, right? Now, what are the other types of cyber threats? I think we spoke of malware, right? Phishing is another classical situation which is actually, people are subject to. And today, that is one of the biggest risks which organizations have to face. What is a phishing? It is basically trying to send you an email that indicates, or it is giving you a tricky situation where you think that mail is true and therefore you download a message or you disclose some unwanted information, or you may probably click on that hyperlink. An example could be somebody sends a mail as though saying that we want your help for filing GST returns and other things. Your colleague or your staff believes it to be true and downloads it. For us, the reality is he's actually sent you some sort of mail which you should perhaps have not downloaded. Then comes spear phishing. It's more of a sophisticated form of a phishing attack, where the attacker learns about the victim and impersonates somebody else. A spear phishing is basically, I do a detailed research about you and then target attack. I had a very recent experience of a spear phishing attack where somebody had done some sort of a basic research, and he sent out he said that, we want your assistance for doing an audit in XYZ country. And he shared all the information before even I could ask. I was not very sure and I was not very confident, and using certain parameters, I was able to identify this fellow is actually trying to play a phishing campaign. So I simply replied, hey, okay, I'm okay with all of this. First, let's have a one-to-one call and then discuss what is the next step. I said, I'm not downloading any of your files. First, let's have a one-to-one call and then do it. He disappeared. He or she disappeared. Right? Next, man in the middle attack, MITM, where you are communicating, somebody in between tries to, get into that conversation and make some mischief out of it, right? So that's a man in the middle attack. Trojans is a type of a malware. Ransomware, the most dangerous fellow who's there in the market today, who actually comes, attacks the system and encrypts your entire data. And the moment he encrypts your entire data, until you pay him or her the money, they're not going to leave away. Right? And again, if you may even make the payment of money, there's no guarantee that you'll get back your data. A variant of this, a Trojan, any of these attacks is called as a denial of a service attack, where you are trying to access a web resource and the access to that web resource is denied. Imagine 100 people trying to access the website at a given point in time. So a genuine user is not able to log in. Right now, what is the impact on this? The impact of this is the genuine user is unable to log in, therefore he is not able to do any operation or transaction. All these fake users have logged in and they're trying to do mischief. Right, a website often could crash because of an over demand, but the demand could be actually a logical or an illogical. The other thing, probably, the list will keep on going. I'll just take one more example, is an example of a data breach. I gave you a scenario, right, where one email ID has been sent to anybody else. That could be considered as a data breach, right? A wrong attachment of client A is being sent to client B, could be a data breach, right? Or it could be that it could be an accidental scenario. There could be cases which we keep hearing, right? Airline crashed, or airline information was made disclosed. This startup company's personal information was disclosed. They had a breach, and whatnot. So now that we understood the entire ambit of a cyber risk, now let's look from an angle of an enterprise risk. Any organization has, these are a few examples of the risk which it is subject to. It could be a strategic, it could be an environmental driven, right? It could be market, credit, operational, or compliance. On the other side, you have a fundamental risk called as the IT risk. And what is this IT risk? A few examples, let's spend some time, right? A simple scenario for a BFSI client. What could be the different types of risk? The information and a cybersecurity risk could be leakage of customer confidential information. It could be Aadhaar, it could be biometric, or whatever, their PII, their bank statements, their loan details, right? You never know. Resilience and disaster recovery. Prolonged outage as a result, a bank or a BFSI entity is not able to meet the requirements of the customer. Okay, maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, in a case of a bank, to some extent, maybe okay. But 30 minutes, 1 hour, 5 hours, people get very, very restless. Very important, and something which is growing in importance today, my dear friends. I should probably annotate that for your benefit. Vendor and third-party management. Because there are a lot of risk associated with vendors. I think less than 6 months or a year back, one of these airlines reported a major breach in their system. And the main root cause was not them, rather the vendor with whom they were associated. He or she had a major breach, which in turn resulted in the airline company's data getting hacked. Right? Project management is all about how do you do projects, changes within the schedule, within the quality, ensuring quality within the time and things like that. The system development and testing, systems which are not subject to regular testing or periodical testing may have or may pose a challenge in future. Quality and governance, whether you're talking about data privacy today, a new legislation is coming up. Whether am I having the systems or the transactions in a manner which is consistent with the quality of the data, right? And technology compliance, because non-compliance could itself lead to fines, penalties, the regulatory pressures, etc. So typically, an IT risk assessment, right? You've looked into various things from a hardware, software failure, human being, and all of those things, and you perform a series of activities in this IT risk assessment. The first one is identifying the risk. Of course, much before that is identifying the asset, right? Every asset has a different type of risk. Modern age startups, right, have very limited of physical security risk. Why? Most of their data is on the cloud. The traditional system, all their setup and environment is on the on-premise. So if on-premise is compromised, entire data is gone. Whereas in cloud, the cloud has to get compromised, which is unlikely, at least for the larger players are concerned, right? So managed with the help of identifying the asset, and then you identify the various risk. Then you assess the risk. Is this a risk for me or not? Then what do? Mitigate that risk. This is where you are actually giving the anti-dose, right? You are giving the vaccination. You're trying to mitigate, reduce it, eliminate it, all of those things. How do you mitigate the risk? In the next slide, we'll cover a little later. Develop the response plan and periodically keep on reviewing it. Right. An example is what you see over here. You may simply choose to avoid the risk. I think just cancel this project. It doesn't make sense for me to go with the project. Maybe transfer the risk, transfer to a third party, transfer it to a service. Give it to an outsourced party. Many times companies outsource their payroll activities. Mitigate, do something to reduce the impact, right? You may actually install an antivirus software, you may provide training to employees, and last is accept. Certainly, that this is going to happen, but even if it happens, the risk is relatively low, right? So what is it that I can do to mitigate or move away from this, right? So that's basically what is the accepting of risk. These are a few examples of sources of risk, something worth looking into, especially when you're doing an audit, right? You're entering into a legal relationship, you're entering into a commercial transaction, there's an economical circumstance, there's a human being involved, human behavior, there's a natural event, and acts of God. All of these are combinations, political circumstances. All of these could probably result in aggravating the risk, right? At this point, I'll just pause for a minute so that I can, take any questions if you have. Any questions, if it is there at this point in time, I can quickly take it. Otherwise, we will quickly move on to the next section.
Option to put in chat box and give the rights to.
You can put it in the chat box, or anybody has questions, you could probably unmute yourself and ask it. We can have it interactive. Anything from a risk perspective, then we'll come into the audit aspect. You have an option to raise your hand, just like how I've done it. Okay, somebody did raise, or they were just trying to do a testing. They were perhaps trying to do a testing, user acceptance testing, feature testing. Okay, if there is none, we'll quickly move on in the interest of time and then probably pick up some more questions towards the end, right? Now comes an interesting thing. Now that I've identified risk, right, I need to put them into a particular tabular structure so that I am able to convert this IT risk into a next actionable item. And therefore, I prepare what is called as a beautiful document, a risk matrix. You write down the various types of risk. For each of those risks, you write two interesting things. One is called as the severity, or popularly called as impact. The second is called as probability or likelihood. Repeat, probability or likelihood. The other is severity or impact. That means what is the extent of impact of a particular risk in case it materializes? How much can it have an impact, right? What is the severity, right? On the other end, you also have a probability. What is the possibility? 1 out of 100, 1 out of 5,000, 1 out of 1 lakh, right? What is the probability of a harm occurring, right? And you typically convert it into a matrix such as this, right? Certainly, likely, possible, unlikely, right? And on top, you write it as what is the impact? It is a negligible impact, marginal, it's critical, it is catastrophic. Whenever there is loss of life, we always refer to as catastrophic, right? And even if it is a catastrophic, but it is unlikely to happen, you will still be extremely cautious, right? But this could be probably be, instead of having a 4 into 4 pillar, you have it only 3 into 3 pillar, high, medium, low, right? High, medium, low. So any of these combinations, whatever I notice, the cells, what you see inside is the risk treatment. An example could be something which is marginal and something which is likely. I will go ahead and accept this risk. But if it is critical, I may probably consider transferring this risk, transfer, outsource, whatever it is, right? But as if it is very catastrophic, possibility is low, I may probably mitigate. Or if it is marginal, the probability is extremely high, I may want to mitigate it. Right? Examples, let's pick up. You're talking about an organization which has not restricted the USB sharing access. Now, is USB subject to heavy risk? The answer is 100% yes. Why? Pen drive, unwanted information comes in, virus, or using the pen drive can copy the data. Whatever information you want goes out, right? Sensitive information may go out. In those cases, marginal could be, may not be the answer. It could probably be a critical and a likely, or a critical and certain. So in all of these cases, you may probably want to mitigate it, or you may want to transfer, give the responsibility to somebody else and say, hey, there's some sort of a challenge which is actually occurring, right? What do I do next? Right? So that's where I'm actually looking to. How do you decide the probability and severity? It is based on every industry, based on what could go wrong, and some bit of a past experience. An industry has never had any sort of a risk like this. Well, okay, maybe it may be marginal or somewhere between marginal to critical, or maybe it may be possible or likely, right? But if an industry or a similar industry has in the past had an experience like that, it could be high or medium, right? Whereas they do not have a process to mitigate that control in all possibilities that could occur, therefore the risk is always high. So you go ahead and give these values or ratings based on your experience of a similar industry, also of understanding the client. That's why understanding or getting the business clarity in that, in terms of process, in terms of IT risk, becomes very critical. So this is where, as auditors, we follow a risk-based auditing approach, and that's why your SA 315 and 330s are very good reference points. It says, as an IS auditor, you need to assess the risk which forms part of the business environment. I mean, it uses the general word auditor. In this context, we're referring to an IT audit. And SA 330 asks, what is it that the management has designed to ensure the risk is minimized, to ensure the risk is within my appropriate appetite? And that's where a risk-based auditing comes into play. So now I think we need to go a little more deeper into how do I approach a risk-based audit? What are the steps I need to follow, right? So your typical steps start off with a risk assessment. Right? Is the issue at my end? I'm presuming you're able to hear me clearly, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a typical process starts with the risk assessment. And when I use the word risk assessment, this is obviously you need to do after understanding the business, right? You need to understand the business, the context, and evaluate it. Right? Let's take an example. Of course, don't worry. We'll be looking into operating effectiveness and reporting, and this is typically the summary of it which happens. Now, let's take a simple startup entity or a client of yours, an MSME client, who is probably using Tally and maybe one or two softwares for the purpose of tax compliance, GST compliance, or maybe some operational software. Now, what are the possible risks in this particular setup? Risk number one could be that they don't do a backup, and that's mostly the case in all of these clients, right? They have a process of a backup, or even if they have a backup, the backup is done once in 6 months or once in a year, or maybe once a quarter. Is once a quarter backup sufficient? You cannot answer. The business has to answer it. Ideally, it is no, right? And if it is a company, let me be very clear. The company law says that the backup has to be done daily. There is an amendment in the company law which happened this year. Please ensure the company, every company which you are doing the accounting, or the company where they're taking care of it, your backup is done daily. And as a part of an auditor's report, you need to mention this in the subsequent year, right? Where we'll have to figure out, I think the legislation will clarify that, but it's a requirement for auditor. Company accounts rules have been amended, right? This happened, I think, 2 to 3 months. That's an example of a risk assessment. Now, for this risk, you can add the probability, like add the impact, and try to look into it, right? So you understand and evaluate. Once this is done, you see, is there any control and evaluate the effectiveness of the control. You test the operating effectiveness. Okay, I have put in a backup system. Great. Is this backup automatic or manual? Do I have to check every time I take a backup? Is there some sort of an automated process? Right? An example is a company is using an automated backup solution. Great. You check whether the backup solution has been working periodically. You take up for the last 6 months or last 12 months. What is your backup schedule? Pick up for 1 month, see how it has been done. Right? Just pick up a sample of 2 to 3 months. If you feel it is okay, you have tested the operating effectiveness. You may probably not want to go into the depth of operating effectiveness. In that case, you may just want to do a test of one, or you may just want to do a walkthrough of the design. Maybe great, right? And then you do a reporting, right? So these are 4 high-level processes which is involved when it comes into audit, right? What we will do is we'll spend a little bit time into each of them so that we get an idea, right? The first, when you refer to risk assessment, we are obviously referring to what are those significant accounts or disclosures or those critical things from an IT perspective which will have an impact. It could be quantitative, it could be qualitative, it could be impacting short-term, long-term, right? It could have an impact on my financial assertion, right? A financial assertion with regard to completeness. My cutoff procedures are not followed. Therefore, I'm not able to lock the period, and therefore I'm able to pass any entries at any given point of time. My cutoff procedures are impacted, right? Completeness. There is an entry which is passed, and there are some entries which are not posted from my source to the ultimate destination. Maybe I follow different invoicing software. If I compare the different invoicing software versus my financial software, there are a lot of differences. Many entries have not posted, completeness is affected, right? And then identify what are these sources, consider risk out of using this sort of an IT system, right? So that's where your risk assessment plays. Now, this is a classical example which you could probably consider developing, right? Now, what I've written over here is a simple risk register of an organization, which of course we did in-house in our office, right? It talks about multiple domains, governance, security, whatever, some bit of subdomain. Then what are the risks for each of them? What type of risk is? Remember, we spoke of strategic risk, operational risk, etc. So this is a snippet, so therefore only the top few risks I've taken, which is mostly strategic risk. Very important, every risk should have an owner. Why should it have an owner? Because it is the owner's responsibility to mitigate that risk. If ownership is not given in an organization, they will take things for granted and they'll start blaming fingers. And here I've given likelihood and impact consequences, a combination of both. We call it as inherent risk. Inherent risk minus the control is the residual risk, right? The residual risk, you can notice that. So my control is good. That means my residual risk is nothing major. My control is not so great. That means I require periodical monitoring. It could be once in 3 months or 6 months. If it is fair, some bit of a periodic monitoring may still be required, right? So those are scenarios which actually typically come up. Now comes the scenario, how do I understand this? So that's one, the risk part. Now I need to take this next further. You start drafting business processes, you start drafting flowcharts, you start drafting narratives. You prepare a risk control matrix, which I just showed you a few slides back. Right? You also see, can you design the controls by performing the walkthrough? End-to-end process, you perform a walkthrough, you actually make a mention of it. You also define what is called entity level controls. An example of an entity level control is every organization, if you join any level, any department you join, compulsory you need to get 2 people's background, or 2 people should call up and do a background verification of this person. You need to check with at least 2 people. Why? It is your internal protocol. Whether he joins in sales, he joins in marketing, he joins in accounting, he joins in the CEO or managing director's office, it doesn't matter. He'll have to do it. Right? So understand the design of process or design of controls by performing a walkthrough, which is necessary. Next, factor certain specialized areas. Process-wide consideration. For example, A procure to pay and an order to cash will have probably the same process, right? So therefore, those are called as a process level controls, a segregation of duties. Maybe a clerk passes the entry, a manager has to approve it. Those are process levels. And then you want to, one very interesting thing is IT general and application controls. In a few slides from now, again, we'll be covering that. Right? Typical scenario, a sales. These are the multiple processes involved in sales. Order processing, receiving order request, check with customer file, obtain the price, credit control. Can there be risk in any of the process? 100% yes. Something can go wrong, right? And therefore, you also get into this sort of a flowchart preparation. This can help you significantly to document and understand the process. I understand way back in college or in, even in the CA syllabus, you had flowcharts, right? You would probably not even recollect it, no? But to that extent today, only limited numbers and images are there. I think you should be able to look them over, right? So the whole purpose of this documentation is for you to understand where could the possible risk be there. An example could be, while doing a walkthrough, you realize that this price, whatever is supposed to be fixed, is subject to an alteration or approval, or is subject to modification. Then can I say this entire price structure will change? The answer is yes. That is what you will ensure you're not actually doing. Right? So far, so good. Any questions so far? Any questions? Are we good?
Chat box. Probability and severity. How to decide probability and severity?
Yeah, I think I spoke about that. Yes, severity and probability. Probability is based on your past experience, similar industries, etc. I mean, both of them are based on those parameters, but typically your severity varies definitely from industry to industry. But you can look into your past behavior, past experience, and similar peer groups. You should be able to get some idea about it. Right? You may then want to prepare some risk control matrices such as this, what you see. Right? You can refer it to the COSO environment, what you see on the left hand side. Put all of those pillars, what is the inherent risk. You can have it so very detailed if possible. Or on the contrary, simply put an Excel sheet. What is the risk? What is the control? What is the test procedure to audit it? Right? Yes, Mr. Veerachandra, you could probably, I think you had some question, you could go ahead and ask that. Somebody had a question, please go ahead. I think you may have to unmute yourself. If you raised your hand, please unmute yourself.
So can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead.
So who is responsible for preparing this risk register? Is it from the audit team or the risk management team or CRO? Who will be there?
It depends purely on the organization size and scale, but normally it's the management's responsibility to assess the risk. That's what your auditing standards and any of these guidelines say. But many a times management may want to outsource that work to us. So therefore, we have to perform that activity. But if you are providing an external assurance, and as an independent auditor when you're signing off an engagement, it does not make sense for you to prepare the entire risk register and all of these documents. But for your internal risk assessment procedure, you may want to perform it. You can go ahead and do it, right? So normally the entire risk assessment process is the activity of the management. Auditor will review how you have done the risk assessment.
Like other functions of the audit, how they are functioning.
Absolutely same, sir. Absolutely same.
Okay.
But as much as you expect the management to prepare the financial statements and we do the audit, right?
Okay.
But in smaller organizations, it may not be feasible. So maybe we may have to figure out what is the ideal way out between.
Okay, good, sir. Thank you, sir.
Elangovan, I am also a cybersecurity practitioner for a bank. Okay, I just want to know how far the penetration of NIST and other things in India actually, where we use NIST framework as the basis of assessing risk. Okay, so how far is the penetration in India about NIST, or is there any other framework that people use?
See, NIST is a set of best practices which is given from an US parlance perspective, right? Because the US government typically came up with these requirements for obviously their own government-owned requirements, right? In India, we have what is called as the CERT cert. So the cert requires certain organizations to be subject to certain verification, right? And there is no benchmark standard, unlike the NIST. The NIST gives you a guidelines, right? Whereas the CERT gives you only a broad-based principles. It does not give you a detailed set of guidelines, right? So the best practices is something which we can definitely look into. And we obviously have options to question. An example, a simple example, right? A NIST guideline would say, hey, two-factor authentication is mandatory. Now this, you need to see in from an RBI angle. It says it is mandatory. The regulation itself says. Therefore, you have to implement it. The SEBI has recently told all your mobile banking, all these mobile apps which is doing the trade, right, has to have a mandatory biometric based authentication. And if the even biometric does not work, an OTP based session, you will have to enable it, right? So in that case, it becomes mandatory. Now for an SAP based system, two-factor is optional, right? So that way the NIST guidelines is definitely a good reference point. NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technology. Basically, the US government came up with this framework or the standard for US government own initiatives or their own companies, subsidiaries, or for the government itself. But those are so very good that people also, external people also started using it. And the NIST guidelines were expected by the US government to be implemented by those companies providing support to government, right? They're doing some IT support, etc. Right? In India, we don't have that way, but an ISO 27000 is considered to be a benchmark guideline to get started. But again, ISO does not say you have to go into this level of granularity. It talks about a management system. So there is obviously a room for interpretation, and that's where our expertise comes in.
Thanks. CERT applies to all industries or any specific industry?
CERT is normally applicable only where the government has mandated that you need to get a CERT enabled audit or a CERT empaneled auditors to verify it. And mostly it is for BFSI, some places in cybersecurity. So the IRDA, RBI, and SEBI, these three regulators somewhere, most of the places mandate.
It's CERT, is it?
CERT, CERT, yeah.
Okay. Thanks for your explanation.
So CERT stands for Cyber Emergency Response Team. That's basically what it is. And it's supposed to, the whole purpose of CERT coming is tomorrow, if there is something which is damaging the sovereignty or the technology very framework of India, these are the guys who will come in as an emergency response team to solve it, right? If there was a state-sponsored attack on the digital ecosystem, right? So these are the fellows who actually come, and it's more like a digital army. That was the intention. But then slowly the broader perspective started coming into picture, and they started coming up with some guidance.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, somebody else had a question. Okay, if there is no more questions, we'll quickly move ahead. But what I'm going to do quickly is, in the chat window, I'm going to share the link of the CERT guidelines just for your reference, whoever was asking for it. So you can probably refer to that. Yeah, let's quickly move on. Again, request you to mute all the participants just to avoid the echo. Right. So now that we are clear in terms of what we do, right? Now the question is, how do I test it? Now, this operating effectiveness testing, nowhere the regulation has clearly spelled out that whether you need to do an operating effectiveness testing or not. And therefore, this is a question which we have to ask ourselves. First, before even go and jump into it, what is this operating effectiveness testing? Simple scenario. You have a control, right? You are auditing a control. Please understand, an IT audit is mostly to do with auditing the control, right? Now you check whether the control existed or did not exist, as simple as that. Now you are going for the audit on a concerned day. It is likely that the control will exist and work on that day. However, you go backwards, it may or may not have operated on that historical period, right? When you as an auditor, you do two types of an audit. One is called as a design audit and one is called as an operating effectiveness audit. In a design audit, you expect the person to give a walkthrough of the entire setup. How does it work? What happens? What are the pros and cons? What are the changes? Right? How does the software or the technology operate? And while he's giving a walkthrough, you ask so many questions focused on the risk, and then you realize, okay, he has some controls to reasonably cover that risk. This is called as a design audit. Majority of the regulatory requirements stop with design audit. There are only certain very particular cases where they expect you to demonstrate an operating effectiveness audit, right? And when you do an operating effectiveness audit, the extent of testing is in depth, which means you will pick up the entire last 1 year or 6 months, as the case may be, and tell, hey, for the period of the 6 months, give me all the scenarios, or what I popularly call it as population. From the population, you pick up a sample and say, okay, for these 10 samples, please show me how have you done this. Let me give an example. I am saying all my employees' USB is blocked. So what will you do? You will ask, okay, show me your laptop, USB is blocked. Obviously, it's going to be blocked because you are right in front of him, he would have taken care. So what you do is, at that point in time, you ask them, give me the list of your employees. He gives you. On some random basis, you pick up, let's say, 5 as an example, right? Normally, the sample size is higher. 15 is for a low risk, 25 is for a medium risk, and 40 is for a high risk, right? That's how the categorization is. You pick up 5 or 10 in this scenario, just for an example, right? And you ask them, hey, give me these 10 people's laptops, or, show it to me. I want to check whether USB is actually blocked, right? And here you are doing an operating effectiveness testing. Right? See, the law never said that you need to express an opinion based on design or operating effectiveness. Similarly, regulators do not do it. But there are some cases it is mandatory that you need to express an opinion on operating effectiveness. Example, Companies Act, Section 143. An auditor is expected to give an opinion on the internal controls over the financial reporting, including the operating effectiveness thereof. Which means that I need to mandatorily give an opinion on the operating effectiveness. And when I do that, my dear friends, I need to give a justification. I need to do a sample testing. Right? So that's basically where your operating effectiveness comes into play. Another area where operating effectiveness becomes very handy or very important, right, is the, to get a comfort based on requirements such as your SOC 2. In a SOC 2, which is your service organization controls, right? An area where we as a firm exclusively specialize on, right? Where the expectation is that the independent third party, who is an audit firm, such as us, verifies and tests the controls for a period of time and expresses an opinion on the operating effectiveness. Right? And that is where it becomes very, very handy. And you follow a sampling strategy, you have a risk assessment method, and and that is where the test of operating effectiveness is very crucial. Right? And please bear in mind that you as an auditor could give a disclaimer in your report saying that I've done only a design audit and not in an operating effectiveness. It is something which is justified, but depends upon the engagement which you have taken up. Tomorrow, if there is a case of an action or regulator says, hey, why have you not done an operating effectiveness audit? You could defend it, or the regulator could say, hey, you have not done your job correctly, right? So both the ways that argument is there. So be a little more cautious when you sort of design and define any of these, right? So that's as far as the nature, timing, and assessment is concerned. Next comes testing of key reports and spreadsheets. This is a very important control, which unfortunately in India, we are not doing so much into the detail. Now, what happens here, let me tell you. Most of the time you go to a bank or a financial institution or any organization, they say, sir, there's a system generated report and here is the report. Now, how sure are you that the system generated report is valid and accurate? How sure are you that, there has not been any modifications in the system generated report, right? The expectation is that auditor should be given the view only access and he only should extract it. But we should understand all the systems, right? It is not possible. And with the limited amount of time, if we spend 1 or 2 days just understanding how that fellow software works and we extract it, it is not going to work out. Therefore, we rely upon him, or they have to give us the evidence on how they have extracted these key reports. And these reports could be multiple types, right? Standard reports, which is provided by the software, nothing much you can do. Customized reports, there is a need for you to test it, right? There could be something called as a saved search report. What is a saved search report? You're extracting certain fields and you say, okay, I want only this parameter for my analysis. I'll give you a simple example. Most of you today in your tax audit, you are supposed to report, I think under clause 44 of your tax audit, the expenses which are incurred with the GST and without GST. I think that's a requirement. Now, when you're reporting with the GST and without GST, there is a necessity for you to extract from a ledger. How do you do it? You would have said, hey, give me all expenses, filter based on GST applicable or not. Now, that's a saved search report. You're using a search criteria based on that you're putting. Now, how do you test the efficacy of that? That's where your report testing comes in. In US, they call this concept as IPE testing, information provided by entity testing. In India, some of the companies call it, some of them they just call it as a report testing. Right? You need to sample them out, etc. And at the same time, you need to consider the performance team, whoever is performing their sampling, performing controls, testing, etc. Not to forget, the sample size is something which is mentioned out here. I will take the question, sir. Just give me a minute, right? Sampling strategy is something which is mentioned over here. It depends on the frequency of control. If it's an annual control, it's normally 1, right? So population is also 1, sample size is also 1. If it's a quarterly control, the sample size is 2. If it's a monthly control with 12 population, right? Because it's monthly, right? You take anywhere between 12 to 5, and normally you take 3. 3 is a moderate risk, right? If it's a weekly control, you again take anywhere between 5 to 15. Again, 10 is a possible size. Daily 250 controls, you may probably take 2 to 40, 30 or 25 could be a mid-range. Multiple times could be even 30 or 45,000, right? So that's typically how it has been done. And again, you have justification where you can go ahead and modify it. There are some statistical softwares which can actually give you a better sample size and things like that. Yeah. I'll complete reporting and I'll take the questions if that is okay, so that I complete that therefore. Right? You evaluate what? The control deficiencies. Control deficiencies could be defined by you. Control deficiencies could be based on the risk, or the control deficiencies could be based on a framework. RBI says these are the controls you need to implement, you audit against them. A classical example, every NBFC, there's an opportunity, my dear friends, there's an opportunity. Every non-banking financial company on an annual basis have to be subject to an IT audit. The RBI guideline is very clear. And if the advance or the loan book size is more than 500 crore, it has a detailed set of requirements, a beautiful opportunity for you. Right? And this is a classical thing, this is how you can actually increase your scope and practice, right? A little later, I'll speak about those opportunities as well. Right? So evaluate the control deficiencies. What is it that the law has spoken, or what is the control? Is there a deficiency? What is the deviation? Is it a material weakness, therefore it is impacting my opinion? Is it something that can be remediated? Right? Or is it something that cannot be remediated? Or even if the remediation happens, it has an impact only as of today, not as of the past. You may probably want to raise memos, you may want to raise management communication, or you may want to report it, right? So that's typically what you actually do. Right? At this point in time, again, I'll stop because there were some questions which people had, and I will let you speak. And if you have any feedback, any flow or any other thoughts, please put it in the chat window so that I can add more examples and other aspects. Yes, please. A couple of them had raised your hand. Please go ahead. What about manual operations process during IT audit? Which are the overall process operation? Do the auditor has to consider manual operations during reporting? A very good question. Now, it depends on what is your scope you have agreed upon. If you're reporting to an organization or a regulator only on the automated controls, right? It's purely defined based on the scope which you're auditing. Let's take a simple example. I audit various IT controls, IT automated controls on behalf of other, CA firms where they want some sort of an additional comfort. They say, Narasimhnan, can you please give me that comfort on this particular client? I said, yeah, let's do it. right? In that case, our reporting requirement is only on that automated controls. We don't touch the manual controls. But you are giving an opinion on the entire IT system and infra of the NBFC or the insurance company, or for that matter, any small client. In that case, you need to factor the manual controls as well and see how they are interlinked within the overall system, and is there a possibility or is there a possible scenario that manual controls are failing, right? So you need to evaluate from that angle as well. You'll have to just be a little careful about that. Very good. Great. Right. How do you decide materiality? Again, materiality is based on the judgment of an auditor. But what are the few critical points which you should probably look into, right? So criticality of a business process, the cost of the hardware, software, what is the possible risk if it goes wrong, right? Potential cost of error, wastage, rectification, claims, right? All these are a few parameters which you should probably consider before you determine what is material, not material, right? Even in an IT also you have materiality, right? If the volume is huge, value is small, it is still material because of the volume, right? So it's very important that you look into it, right? So a few examples which you can look into: number of accesses or transactions which are processed in a particular period, right? What are the what are the number of scenarios which are occurred? For example, inventory movement without a value, right? How many instances of service level agreements are breached, right? First of all, is the service level agreement tracked, right? What are the potential penalties? What are the failures for complying with legal and contractual requirements? So all of these becomes your audit materiality, and these become critical pointers, right? So those are your audit materiality. And therefore, to mitigate all of this, I think the focus is on understanding various types of IT controls. And typically, your IT controls examples are what you see out here: securing your computers, using antivirus softwares, updating software, using a backup system, securing with passwords, training IT staff, right? But the reality is not this. This is something which you actually, at a broad level, you divide your controls as. One from a preventive directive corrective angle, from a nature of highest resource angle, from a nature of functional angle, right? A control could be any of these combination. For example, I may have a preventive control for a physical access which is operational in nature. Simple example, an access card. It's a physical access, it prevents, it's for my day-to-day operation, right? I may have a preventive control or a logical access which is administrative in nature. A policy which says that give me access only on a need-to-know basis, right? So it is very important that we understand how these control operates, because these controls are what we are ultimately auditing. And when you look into any IT audit, you typically examine any of these which is mentioned over here. It could be application, it could be governance, it could be security, vendor ops, cloud operations. By the way, cloud operations, lot of importance. Please be very, very clear in terms of the responsibilities between you and the cloud service provider. Why? Because the cloud service provider has a very interesting set of responsibilities, and many a times there are responsibilities on the end user. I'll give you a classical example, right? Today, all of us are connected using this app called as Zoom, right? Now, the Zoom app is a cloud service. It's a cloud app. That's how all of us are able to use it. And you had to install the Zoom app, or you went to the DLH portal. From there, the Zoom automatically ran. Likewise, for me, I had to install this particular app, and we are using this. Now, accidentally, let us say the configuration went something wrong. As a result, an unwanted user came in, or a mute setting was not disabled. As a result, everybody was speaking and it started echoing. Can I sue Zoom for that? The answer is no. It is the user responsibility. So any of the cloud apps, the most important thing we need to understand is what is the responsibility of the user and what is the responsibility of the cloud service provider. Many of the service providers will say, hey, my software is saved in Amazon, it is saved in Microsoft. So if Microsoft fails, mine will fail, and it is not possible that Microsoft will fail, right? Those all arguments are nice to hear. You need to clearly understand the cloud architecture and who is owning what sort of responsibility, right? Who's owning what sort of responsibility, right? I have just written a very interesting article on cloud responsibility in this latest, I think, October issue of the Karnataka State CAA journal. Very, very interesting. And last 4 or 5 issues, if you go back, I've been frequently speaking on what is IT audit, how to do an IT audit, general controls, application controls, a lot of these things, right? So it is a good read. It's probably a 5 or 6 series. If you see me on LinkedIn also, I would have posted many of these articles, right? So that's basically a very interesting bucket, right? Understanding the cloud service responsibilities. And typically, when do you do an IS audit? It is basically either an internal stakeholder requirement, or the management says, hey, I want to do it, or it is done based on an external requirement, right? An independent party for legal requirements or testing purposes. And you could do it for any of these requirements as such, right? So moving a little more into classification of these IT audits, because we understood the process, we also now need to see how these audits can be classified. You have something done based on compliance. There is an RBI framework. There's a payment card industry framework. You're following that. As an extension of financial audit, right? As a financial auditor, you want to get some sort of an assurance or comfort. You may probably do it. Operational audit, designed to evaluate the internal controls, logical, security, something very, very small. You may probably do an integrated audit, an administrative, or something at an extreme case, a digital evidence evaluation exercise, such as a forensic audit, right? So your audits could be classified under these, and you have scope for opportunities in each of them, right? The most common audits, according to me, are the first two, either extension of a financial or for the purpose of compliance. Otherwise, people never want to invite an auditor, come and do an audit on my independent, right? Before I head into it, again, I saw a few hands raised. We can have a couple of questions. I'm making a little interactive so that, it doesn't look a monologue. And if we were in person, we would have loved those conversations. Yes, please. A couple of them raised your hand. I see Srinivas. Mr. Srinivas, yes, please go ahead. Anybody else? Sorry, I think. Go ahead, unmute yourself, please. You able to unmute it? Selva, can you just help them?
Everyone was given right to unmute themselves.
Yeah, you can unmute yourself in anybody want to. You have the access. Yes, Mr. Adarsh, please go ahead.
And Rajiv sir also, yes, raised.
Okay, Mr. Rajiv, please go ahead. I'm not sure if that was an accidental
But raise and
okay, no problem. In the interest of time, we'll keep it going. If you have any questions, we'll okay. Now I see a couple of them. Yeah, please go ahead. So Rajiv, please go ahead.
Suresh sir, are we audible to you, sir?
Okay, Mr. Krishnamurthy, please go ahead. Okay, Chandrasekhar, Rajiv.
Sir, am I audible, sir? Chandrasekhar.
Yes.
Here.
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
Sir, we have chosen some sample and perform the testing, but unfortunately, if the testing fails because we got some negative results, so what will happen? We'll pick a different sample or give mention the report straight away.
Very good question. Very good question. Now, the moment you get a variation in the sample, right? You have chosen, let us say, 15 samples are very simple to get started with, right? 15 samples you got. Even if one fails in that 15 samples, right? As an auditor, you need to take additional samples. An additional you can take about 10. And if you feel that in that additional 10, right, there was no failures, you can pass the control. That's the normal protocol.
Okay.
Right. However, In the additional sample also, if one more control fails, you will go ahead and qualify the entire control. You'll qualify, not the audit report, you'll qualify the entire control.
Got it. Got it.
Yes, please. Yes, Sneha, please go ahead. Snehal, sorry. I saw one question, how to start a career in IT audit. I'm appearing for DISA this November and I have to pursue this area. There's a lot of opportunities, sir. First get done with the basic qualification. Towards the end, I'll also speak of a few minutes about opportunities and career. Okay, let's move on. I think we not had much of questions there, right? So that's on classification of audits. Now, how do I decide the scope? The most important thing, how do I decide the scope, right? Very, very important. In a financial audit, you already know the scope. It's nothing beyond the financial statements. In case of tax audit, you have that list annexure to tax audit report. When it comes to IT audit, please clearly articulate what the scope is. More often than not, it is done based on a regulatory requirement. Therefore, reference it with a regulatory requirement. Right? So I highly recommend that you benchmark it with that first. Second, if nothing is clear, you could probably use this particular Excel sheet, this sheet, what I'm presenting. Feel free to take a snip of it, right? It could be the scope. The most common element out of this in most of the audits will be IT access management, right? And then you have IT operations. In this, there are also additional elements like change management, development, DevOps cycle, if you're using startups, etc. So those are all certain specific things which you can probably pick it up, right? And then you have your new domains of audit, cloud audit, third-party risk assessment, data privacy, auditing of bots, automated processes, right? So these are all interesting cases which could probably come. Now, how do I distinguish between a general control and application control? And that is something very important, right? Any IT control could be bucketed under to a general or a application. A control embedded within an application is an application control. Example, Zoom has a feature where if I want, I can unmute all of you or mute all of you. That's an example of a feature built into the application, IT application control. IT general control. In order to access Zoom, you have to enter username, password, or you have to enter through DLH, and through that you have to enter. That's IT general control, right? You're getting the difference. Application control, general control. Now, this is how this entire landscape will fall out. Whatever you see in the red or maroon is the scope of IT general controls. Whatever you see in that blue is the scope of IT application control. A very beautiful image, actually. It gives you the entire perspective clearly. Right? In any organization you do, there will definitely be some systems which is being used, right? But it is just not that system. It is much beyond those systems. It is much beyond that systems. Why do I say it's much beyond the systems? Because it's a process. It is the human being. It is the IT network and infra. It's a physical access security. I'm talking about, let's say, an example of a Tally. Right? So instead of SAP, you replace it with Tally. Tally runs on a Tally owned database, ODBC system, right? Which in turn runs on a Windows machine. Now, if that Windows machine is Windows 7 or Windows Vista or Windows 8, Microsoft has stopped support. If it's Windows 8.1, you have another 3 months, right? Very soon, Windows 10 also will stop. Everybody start moving to Windows 11. And after Windows 11, you'll go to Windows 12, 13, we do not know. Right? So you need to keep on moving up and understand what are the IT risks. Anything which is dealt at the application level, which is basically what I've circled out here, or the blue color, is what is your scope for IT application audit. Rest all is your IT general control audit. Right? Please bear in mind, in addition, changes made to application will also be an IT general control audit, not a IT application audit. Be very, very clear with the scope. 90% of the time, 90% of the time, unless there is a clear requirement, we don't do an application audit, because an IT application audit normally goes hand in glove with the business process audit. The what? Business process audit. I hope you're able to see my screen. I've just written the word BP, right? Not blood pressure, business process. What's a business process audit? Procure to pay, order to cash, hire to retire, or in layman's language, sales cycle, purchase cycle, inventory cycle. In that, there is a business process. As a part of the business process, there is an automated control. That is something which we are auditing, right? That's an automated control. Anything outside that is this. So if I have to classify controls, I mean, of course, you will find that a little later, right? You will have entity level controls, process level controls, right? Technology driven controls. So like that, multiple classifications are there, and your scope has to be very clearly articulated and understand. I'll give you live examples when I bring up that particular image of the site, right? I'll quickly move. Oh, it's just here. It is just here, right? Now, this is something which you have to clearly understand where the scope falls in. You have your underlying IT here in the extreme bottom. I'll probably use a blue marker. It may probably be better, right? You have an underlying IT environment out here, right? It has IT systems, infra, financial data, all of those. Now, there is a risk arising from the use of that, and that is what your IT general control aims to mitigate them. At the same time, there are also certain different types of controls. Somebody was asking, a manual control. HR operations many a time are manual controls. IT dependent manual control. That means it is not fully automated. There is a dependency on IT. And then you have a completely automated. Classical example is a three-way match system. You know, your purchase order, your invoice, or your delivery note, right? And your goods is, you know, all the three should match. Only then the entry gets passed, right? All of this influences your entity level controls, process-wide controls, thereby your risk arising from processing transaction is minimized, right? And not to forget, you have your own financial assertions, accuracy, completeness, cutoff on that, right? Some controls operate across, and those you can probably call it as indirect entity level controls, or simply call it as an entity level controls as such, right? An example could be the board oversight is always an entity level control, right? An internal audit, the fact that you have an internal audit is always an entity level control, because it's an overall pillar. Into a particular process, you look into it, that is a process level control. Within the process level control, you may have a application control or a general control. Or I'll probably say within that process, you may have a manual control or a technology based control. If it's a technology based control, IT general control, IT application control, right? So that's basically how you fit into your scope, right? So that's something which you have to be very, very clear, because that is what will decide your scope and how you take it further. And this is, if you ask me, is a vault of information. Anybody who does IT general control audit, this is your scope. Anywhere you go, ultimately you'll follow this, right? On one side, you will basically look into access. Access at what? Access for application, access for database, access for operating system, access for network. Four things: application, database, network, operating system. These four have to be looked into. Now, what will you look for all these four access? First, how do you authenticate? Username, password, OTP, all of those, right? Authentication. Second, how are you giving access? Third, if a user leaves, are you terminating the access on time? Fourth, user is not leaving, but there is a movement. How is that a factor? And last, fifth, is there a periodical access review? If you are taking care of these five broad things, right? The five broad things, access is something which is a cakewalk. What are those five things? First, how do users authenticate? Second, how are you giving access to users? Approved, segregation of duty, you know, maker, checker, all of those. Third, user termination. Fourth, user movement. And last, periodical access. This is done at an operating system level, application level, network level, database level, right? One specialized in addition to all of this is powerful users or privileged users at each of them. This could probably call it as a sixth also. how privileged access are treated. So for privileged users also, all these 5 will come into this, right? That's access. Then you have what is called operations. Operations is very simple, day-to-day functioning. How am I doing? There are multiple batch processing which is run. An example of a batch processing could be interest rate calculation. For all the customers, the savings bank interest is calculated on a particular date. It's processed as a batch. Interface processing, application A speaking with application B, your Uber and Paytm speaking with each other, right? Monitoring of your computer processing, some logs are there and the monitoring takes place. Backup, very important, backing up of your data, right? And last is computer center related operations, right? So that's basically what. And then you have 2 more pillars. One pillar comes into picture only when there is a development. The other pillar will come into picture normally in all scenarios, change management process. What is it? Program change management. If you see system development and program changes, more or less will be the same. The extent of testing and the depth will be very detailed in system development. In program change, it will be mild, small changes to the programs. I had a bug, I had to change it. Whereas in system development, I do an entire development exercise, right? But if you see, more or less, this activities will be the same, right? Any questions at this particular point? And let me tell you, this is the wealth of ITGC, right? How do you actually test it, right? This covers most of the scope of ITGC. Fair enough. So I've just picked up a small sample case just as a use case or a study based scenario for you to pick it up. And does system development means ERP implementation? It is one level before that, sir. It is not just implementation. It is starting from the stage of acquisition, deciding which ERP to go through, how you are implementing it, how you are configuring it, how are you doing the old versus the new, are you doing the data conversion, are you bringing in parallel system, how the user is giving a sign off, are all of these documented, are segregation of duties configured, right? How are the masters configured, the entire cycle, right? That is what you look into it, right? So in case of an ERP implementation, the pre and the post activities. In case of another organization, they may not probably do a pre and a post, they may probably do on a consolidated basis, right? They may probably use an ad hoc solutions as well. Right, so there's a sample example as I just told you, right? In an access to programs and data, which is basically program changes. What do? The focus is on whether am I preventing inappropriate or unauthorized use of systems. Right? Do I have security policy? Do I have a user access review? Do I have unique IDs who are using it, or is there sharing of user IDs? These are just examples, right? Access to programs. Sorry, this is access to programs. I'm sorry. The second is program changes, right? Program changes is basically what is the frequency of changes which I'm making to the program? What is the change management process? Then comes program development. Please understand the difference. Changes is different from development. Development is typically your system development life cycle. And your computer operation. So broadly, this is what 4 things you will focus in any ITGC. It can have multiple variations, but this is what it will be, right? And you look at all of these in all the layers: application layer, database layer, operating system layer, and network layer. So just re-emphasizing what I just spoke in the last 2 slides. You also have an application audit where you look into various checks which are performed by the application. It could be completeness, input checks, authorization checks, forensic control checks, various types of these checks are also possible, but that's done on the application related controls, right? Maybe that's a topic for discussion on another day. Just to give a difference between an application and the general control operate surrounding the environment. Application controls operate within the environment, right? And you may follow a test of one strategy in application, whereas in IT general controls, you may follow a sample test, right? So generally in general controls, we do a sampling, we don't do a test of one. Are you clear with this? Questions? Okay, no questions is always good. Either you understood nothing or you've understood everything. I will always take the positive side of things, right? So a few of these application controls what you normally test, the inputs what you feed in, the processing done by the system, the output it may probably generate, right? So what is an approach for an IT general control testing? As I said, first is the risk assessment, right? Looking into the scope, defining the controls. I think we already looked into all of this. This is your phase one. Phase two is where you obviously go ahead and ask a document request list. In India, you call it as list of requirements. In US, you call it as PBC provided by client, the PBC request and all those fancy names, right? Basically, for each control, what are your list of requirements? And for each of them, what is the population? What is the sample size and everything you normally ask? And you can put up a requirement like this. I've just given a small extract, right? So I want a population for what? The control says, a standard password policy has been defined. So therefore, I will require the password policy, right? What is the system? This is an app called as Windows Active Directory, an app called as Dynamics, an app called as HighJump. Some random. What are the rest of requirements? 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? You require the policy, you require the screenshot, you require how the password has been configured. Right? Sometimes you may also give the detailed step on how you have to get this, but many times the company or the client will normally be aware how they will be able to extract this, right? And today most of these are automated. So that's typically how you go. So that's a phase two. Once you've got all of this, right, you may also obviously want to look into the sampling risk. This is a slightly a different version of sampling, a little more in-depth, where risk of the control is higher, risk associated with the control is lower, and scenarios like this, right? There's an additional variation of sampling. But you can remember the rule of thumb, which I said, 10, 15, 25, 35, 35 to 40, right? So those are the maximum sample size which you actually begin. And then comes the detailed testing. Against the control requirement, you test it. It could be the design, it could be the operating effectiveness, whatever you're speaking, and you start documenting them, right? Very important is the documentation. I'll show you a sample case of documentation. I think I have a template of that, right? And then if there is a situation where you've got a finding, you send it out to the management and see if there is a necessity for you to do a remediation testing. If not, you probably qualify that particular control and report. Please bear in mind, just because one control has failed, it does not mean the entire system has failed, right? Control will always be dependent on failure, right? But even if a control has failed, it may not impact the overall risk in the audit, right? So those are typical scenarios which you should be aware of. Just a few examples, I'm sure all of you are aware. What are the testing methods? You do an inquiry, right? You ask them questions, ask various questions. Audit is all about asking intelligent questions, right? Sometimes you inspect, they give you an evidence, screenshot they give you, right? You inspect that. Then you may probably do a corroborative inquiry, right? You ask much more questions, ask one question and double check that question with somebody else, right? System query, you ask a query to the system and ask a screenshot, right? Are there any exceptions which are defined with the system? These are a few examples which you can probably use. I think we already spoke of this test of design and test of effectiveness. Design is more to do if the control is operating properly, right? Whereas an effectiveness for a given period of time, is it effective and is it working in the manner which it is necessary? So that's basically the design versus effectiveness. Again, an area which we discussed. And then comes the last piece of the cake. How do I document it, right? So I need to document what are the applications used, what are the details of the infrastructure, what is the structure, what is the governance, what are the risk and controls, right? Typically, an example could be something like this. When I do a financial audit, I send out this template to my client and say, hey, please go ahead and give this information. What are the applications you use? What is the purpose for which you're using it? What is the database you have? Who maintains it? What is the financial relevance? Are there interfaces? What is the OS? How is the network? What is the storage? You can add some 3-4 more features, and this becomes a fairly comprehensive. Based on this, you can decide what you have to look into this year and probably look into the rest between the years, right? And once you've got this, you can start doing documentations like this. This is a sample document where you have a control, you have a control description, right? This is where you do in-depth verification and testing. Please bear in mind, these are required as per your SOX and IFC requirements, but this format you may not follow for some other clients, right? So it depends upon a case by case. And every test you normally have what is called as a testing attribute. What are the test attributes? What are the testing matrices, right? And that's how it typically works. Once you have done it, you have to obviously report the finding, right? You have an observation, you might say that, hey, there was no procedure for entity A, entity B, or it may just have one thing. You may also give a root cause analysis. And what is the root cause analysis? What is the source? Was the design itself a failure? Or I had designed a control, but the control was not effective, so operational failure. Or the system itself has a flaw, system failure, right? And then you also have the risk rating, high, medium, low, and things like that, right? So these are few examples of findings. A detailed finding, you normally may present it like this. And these are all good habits, practices which you can follow, by the way, right? And this you can do it even in an internal audit report. All these reporting is not something for only for an IT audit. You can do it even for an internal audit report. Nobody's stopping you, right? Just tweak the wordings and other things. Right? Are there any guidelines and practices to consider for any IT audit? These are a few examples. Standard on audit issued by our ICI. Section 143 of the Companies Act, where we have an ICO for guidance note, right? Then Sarbanes-Oxley Acts, the SOX, ISO 27001, a good practice, best practices framework, ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library, COBIT, which is again COBIT 2019, COBIT 5, and then we have COBIT 2018. Both of them are good frameworks. Cybersecurity framework and the NIST framework, which again somebody made a mention of it. Payment card industry framework, and what is called as the SOC framework, System and Organization Controls framework. I'll just pause over here for a minute if you have any questions. Who is eligible to do IT audit? Good question. Most of the situations, only a chartered accountant itself is sufficient to do an IT audit. Only certain times the regulator insists that you need to either have a minimum of a DISA qualification to do it. Some cases CISA is mandatory, right? And CISA can be done by any independent person also. You need not be a CA to do CISA. It's a completely independent course. So I think I've clarified that. Any guidelines to audit ERP implementation? Manikandan, it's a very, very broad terminology, right? Just go to our Digital Assurance Accounting Board websites. You will have some frameworks for data migration, how you can do an audit. Very good piece of document. This was, I think, made, 4 or 5 years back, or maybe much more than maybe 10 years back also. I'm not able to recollect, but it's a good piece from a data migration standpoint. And any other elements also, there are specific things. Your system development lifecycle audit, if you do, that is good enough for your data migration or ERP implementation. Who will approve the IT audit plan? Good question. IT audit plan is normally approved by the audit committee, right? That's how in an organization, if they have a complete independent setup. I've worked with organizations which are, Fortune 500 or the top 10 companies in the world, where typically the setup is we report directly to the audit committee. On the other end, if it is coming by virtue of an independent engagement, right, the client will request us, and the finance controller or the process owner, whoever is in charge. For example, you are doing under an IFC, the finance controller may probably approve, right? If you're doing it under, let's say, a PCI framework, maybe the information security officer may approve it, right? So there are cases. I'm presently in ERP implementation with no internal audit experience. Is it good to have internal audit experience to shift to IT audit? Definitely internal audit experience is good because it gives you that value added advantage. Because in an ERP implementation, you have technological expertise. That audit expertise is something which is lacking. Probably spend some time in that audit domain so that you can have a combined profile, right? So tomorrow you have 3 skill sets with you. You can do an IT audit, you can do a ERP implementation, you can do a general internal audit as well. Which is a better course to pursue IT audit, whether CISA or DISA? There's no standard answer for it, right? I have seen people who have done CISA, but they have not used that qualification much to that necessity, right? To its justice, right? So as long as These courses are just the first step. After that, a lot more depends on your practical value addition. So DISA is something which is our own institute oriented course, has got a lot of features, key benefits, advantage out of it. And I think it is a good stepping stone for you to get started with it so that you get acquainted yourself and then get into the rest. Right? How to find IT audit opportunities? Just wait. That's my next slide, Mr. Mallikarjun. I'm just covering on that. And how do I know the IT firms audits to associate with them doing the audits? There are very limited number of firms. You can probably visit the CERT empaneled websites. You can, people speak with people like me who actually specialize in this. But this is a growing area, and I think definitely there are opportunities getting lined up. Right, so quickly moving on, what are the opportunities in system audit? Right, I'm just giving you very, very broad, high-level pointers. You may probably have much more than this, right? You can look into ITGC audit, SOC, and other things. I'm not going to go into this, but I'll speak about a regulatory perspective. Right, most of the scenarios, this is where IS audit is mandated. There is a regulatory requirement, IRDA, SEBI, RBI. It's a part of a statutory audit. It's part of a statutory audit, extension of a statute. It's a part of an internal financial control, IFC testing. It's part of an ISO 27001 or a PCI or a COBIT standard. It may be required as a part of a process improvisation. It may be done as an extension of an internal audit. You're already doing an internal audit, a small scope, you may probably do a IS audit. Part of a forensic audit where you have to do some bit of an investigation. Insolvency matters, they are sometimes today asking for an IT audit. Due diligence, they're asking for an IT audit, or some cases, client specific requirements. So this is what I've seen in the last few years of my profession, where typically audits come under, right? Any of this. Regulatory driven, for example, this is what I said, NBFC. You can search online NBFC IT audit requirement. You'll get this beautiful guideline, which you can probably look into it, right? Surendra, I'll just take your question. Just give me a minute. In case of banks, cooperatives, RRBs, all of these are subject to IT audit, including cooperative banks, right? These are a few examples. If you just Google or search, bank IT audit checklist, RBI IT audit checklist, you'll get a beautiful document. It's a very detailed document. It's a very old but very beautiful detailed document. You can use that for referencing of any of the audits, or you can use ISO 27001 framework for audit. It'll give you the entire framework. You can download that into an Excel sheet. That itself is a very good scope for you to do an audit. Right? IRDA guidelines, these are the simple things. IRDA, if you again go to IRDA website, or just search in Google IRDA cyber security checklist or cyber security guideline, you'll get the entire Word document or Excel sheet. You use that, fill up all the right hand side columns. That's another example of how you can actually proceed further in terms of this. This is again a variant. IRDA has this ISNP, where basically all e-commerce solutions provided by insurance company have to be subject to another audit. That's another example here. SEBI has cyber security resilience framework. It speaks about all of this, right? Only one area which I've not spoken about is vulnerability penetration testing, which is called as VAPT, which you notice over here. This is nothing but trying to do an ethical hacking on the system. What is it? Ethical hacking on the system, so that the system is subject to some sort of a check or some sort of a control, or identifying the weaknesses. Are there any drawbacks or loopholes in the system? You're basically trying to do that. Okay, what are the certifications which are there in this particular IT audit course, right? So you can see this entire broad pillar are various types of certifications which we can do, right? Now these are the various domains which as an IS auditor you can do, right? What you see on the green is all relating to governance. You can audit. You can do something to do with risk assessment, third party and fourth party. I've just put in a small circle in red. I hope you're able to notice that. Anything relating to standard and framework you can do. Anything relating to access controls you can audit, right? Anything relating to security engineering. These are all the areas which you have opportunities, right? Those which are not circled are areas which you can audit, but it requires a little bit of a technical expertise, right? Little bit of a technical expertise, and that's how you will approach this, right? Are there any certification courses? Yes, these are examples. CISA is a classical example. You have CCSK, CDNP, all of these again certification. But I think to get started, DISA, maybe if you want CISA, plus more hands-on courses are available. If you go into Udemy or if you go to YouTube, how to do an IT audit practically, etc. And then get started with some actual scenario of how you do an audit, right? So that's how you actually get started. I mean, you cannot at this point of time do another articleship, but at least you can get started by associating with somebody and, okay, this is how I will do an IT audit and get started from that, right? These are few other certifications which are available. I don't want to give you an information overload. These are again a few best practice certification courses. ISC Square and ISACA are two leading organizations when it comes to cybersecurity. The last thing, I'll probably take a couple of minutes, to discuss a small case study, right? So a simple scenario like, I'm giving an IT assurance for a mid-sized organizations. They had simple physical assets, logical assets, firewalls, all of those. And I had to give an opinion on the entire IT infrastructure and system. That's typically how it is. So what are the issues typically being noticed? And these could be with the top 10 or top 20 issues which you'll always face, right? So the typical methodologies, you have an access process, right? You have a gap identification, and obviously you have a report, right? You do all of these things. So what are the top 20 key issues, right? There is no IT policy in place. That itself becomes an audit opportunity, right? There is no IT declaration, or employees are not aware of the IT policies. No training or security awareness given. No password policy. That's one of the most dangerous things. Physical access security not being monitored. Pen drive usage, right? Servers where log reports were not configured, or vendors were not reviewing or doing like periodical verification. Emails were not backed up, right? IT risk register or asset register is not there. Hardware is not subject to a backup or a centralized, alternate method, right? Minimal backups were taken. Location of the company, all locations or all the data was not backed up, only select files were backed up. Antivirus software was probably having some trouble, right? So these are all few examples of the top 20 key issues, right? Which typically, we experience in the scenarios, right? Typical scenario, you explain the issues to the client, help them to remediate them, and see if, subsequent audits are clearing all those issues, right? So that's typically the journey which happens. So my key message to you is the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest opportunities, right? On that note, thank you so much for being a very, very patient audience, right? Of course, I'm going to give you all my credentials and other information, right? I will give you some details about me where you can actually, reach out to me and connect, right? So that if you have any questions, clarifications, we can definitely discuss, right? I'm also sharing my LinkedIn profile. I have a Telegram group where I have a lot of, information relating to IT audits and other things updated. Feel free to share that to your friends, family, and whoever it is, right? And my YouTube channels also have a lot of information. Should you wish to, you can probably, be going through that in detail, right? So that's something which I just thought I should make a mention of. Many people also ask me, sir, what are the various types of opportunities which are available in IT audit, right? So that's another interesting question which many of them want clarity, right? So these are a few examples which you can probably pick it up, right? You can look into this particular sheet itself: IT audit, IT governance, analytics, GDPR, right? Advisory on this emerging technology, cybersecurity consulting, automation and implementation, forensic, right? ISO, PCI standards, SOC, right? So like this, there are a lot of opportunities. These are some of the things which we do in our office, right? Just for you to get an idea. And this is something which is ever growing and finding newer pastures every day in and day out. Right? So I think it makes sense that we spend time into this. It could be from multiple angles. Use this for my own audit, right? I'm already doing an audit. I'm relying too much on the systems. Can I, get a better assurance, right? That is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is I can see this as a potential opportunity, right? Either for my own clients or maybe for somebody else's clients. They don't have the expertise. You come forward and go ahead and do it, right? Those are all possible measures which you can look at. Okay? Feel free to be in touch, and that's all about what I have. We have about 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so. Let's have some candid questions and clarifications. Thank you. Any questions and clarifications, I'll be happy to do. You may raise your hand, unmute yourself. Okay, looks like no more questions. We'll probably give one more minute. Otherwise, we should probably wrap it up and call it a day. Selva, is there any other message we'll have to inform, or it is all good? Nothing more?
Wait for 1 minute, sir. If there's no questions, we'll wind up the session. And for information of audience, there is members, they'll be having assessment to be completed to claim the CP credit. It will be posted in our time, so they can complete in 2 or 3 days time actually under the same login and assessment.
Fair enough. So I think for getting the CPE, you will have to complete the assessment.
And also,
Yeah, please go to the DLH portal. It will be available either immediately after the session for next 2 or 3 days. Please ensure that you complete it.
be available till 17th or 18th, so they can complete in those time. Also feedback can also be submitted in that portal.
Sure.
So there is
Okay, I don't take any specific classes, but in general, I speak in various forums and other things, so you can follow me there. There are a lot of online literature available today on IT audit and other things. You can probably pick it up, or you can write to me. I will give you some resources which is there. We can probably, it could be useful for you.
we're done with presentation, it seems. So will you be sharing the PPT with us?
I will figure out how I can do that and then go ahead.
There's one question.
Okay, somebody is asking, give me an idea about DISA and CISA course, how difficult it is to complete and how it adds value in employment, practicing GST, whatever. Okay. See, the whole purpose of a DISA course is to give you a flavor of an information system audit, how you have to do an information system audit, understand the risks involved into it, right? The DISA is a course by the institute, our own institute. The way the standards and the other things has been followed is basically the Desi style. Whereas the CISA follows the American system and it is from a separate organization. The core objective of the both courses are same, for empowering a person to be IS auditor, right? How he or she will be able to independently do an IS audit, right? Maybe a starting level DISA is a good course for you. Of course, comparatively lesser expensive. CISA I think is fairly around $800 or so, right? But from a cost benefit perspective, CISA is much more, DISA is much more affordable. But having said that, it has about 5 to 6 modules which covers the various nuances. What is IT audit, something on governance, something on system operations, something on system development, something on protection of information assets, etc. Business continuity, disaster recovery. All of those is what you try to cover. The whole broad ambit of an IT audit, what you need to focus is what is covered. Opportunities, it could be multiple, as I already told you. You could probably start taking up independent opportunities, or for your existing work which you're doing, you can use this to validate it. Right? You're a GST practitioner, a client gives you some reports, and based on that, you're relying upon it. Maybe with some bit of technological thought process, you may ask some more questions. So how you use it is left up to you, but this is the value the course brings.
So thank you so much.
Okay.
Spent here, sir, and they come unable to join at the end. She is traveling. It seems so. So on behalf of SARC Chairman, Secretary, Office Bearers in their absence, thank you so much for your time spent on knowledge dissemination.
Thank you.
And thank you for giving us support SARC. And we look forward to have you in a physical session anytime soon, as we have discussed earlier at the start of this.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye.